listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. To guide us through the intricacies and intersections of emotions, relationships, and male identity is renowned psychologist, author, and speaker Gunter.
Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspire Change. Okay, I'm going to take a little bit of a departure. I found myself spending a fair bit of time doing some research in terms of, political, philosophical, and psychological issues over the recent week. And I've always toyed with the idea of responding to, people who carry some influence, they carry some weight in our society with their, ideas, with who they are as a person and with their influence. What sort of things are they generating? And so I couldn't think, actually, in many respects, of a better person to start this process off with than the academic social enigma of this particular, probably decade, I'd say, and that is Jordan Peterson. Now, I know that just like with Elon Musk, I'm about to tap into a fan base that is going to want to rip me to shreds. But hey, folks, how about a little bit of tolerance? Let's think about this from a critical thinking perspective rather than an emotional gut reaction from which you want to deliver a, fast one to my jaw. Okay? This is ultimately supposed to be what we are doing in academia, in politics, rather than this dirty backstreet fighting that I see going on in almost every area, every arena of our society. It's gotten filthy, right? No, Queensbury rules. If you can stick it to the guy or the girl, then you do it, and you do it with gusto. Okay, so I want you to keep in that mind, because that's certainly not my plan to do to Jordan Peterson. However, I do think that he's one of these people who needs to be thought through. And there's many. I mentioned Elon Musk earlier on, and he's certainly, a person that I'll put in a similar category. Now, interestingly enough, materially, Jordan Peterson and Elon Musk are streets apart. But we could argue potentially that both of them are very powerfully influential in each in their own way. So, I could talk about Jordan Peterson as the person, although I don't know him. I only know him through, firstly, his writings, secondly, the interviews and videos that are on YouTube, and through the eyes of some of the people who think he walks on water. And it's interesting because not only have I, devoted some time examining his critics, I also wanted to see what people who have a strong belief in who he is and what he's about. And I wanted to see Jordan Peterson through their eyes. The other aspect to this is, Jordan Peterson, the academic, and I get that, he was seriously pissed off with political correctness. I don't particularly find it that useful either. I'm not a fan of political correctness. I think it stifles critical thinking. It stifles, the exploration and examination of ideas, which in both philosophy, science, the social sciences, is not particularly useful in my book, okay? But the other phenomena that Jordan Peterson has evoked is the sense of the guru. It's like Moses going to the top of the mountain and coming down, with the 10 Commandments. And so, Jordan has come down from the mountain with his 12 rules of life. But unfortunately, he was somewhat, or appeared somewhat, dissatisfied with just the 12 and then chose to inseminate us with an additional 12 rules. So 12 weren't enough. Now we got to 24. And the little bit of, imp in me goes, are we going to see another 12? And if so, what could they be? He talks about order, then chaos, right? Now, it's an interesting way of putting stuff. Now, having read both books, I got to say that personally, as a psychologist and as a therapist of a number of years, and not necessarily heavily academically oriented. Yes, I have lectured, I've taught, a supervised psychologist. I was sort of underwhelmed with what he'd written, and his constant drawing in sort of political, pseudo-scientific, and sort of pseudo-philosophical, if there is such a thing, stuff into how to be a better person didn't really grab my attention. Okay, now, obviously at this point in time, some of you are going to go, I know where this is going. He's going to tear shreds of Jordan Peterson. He doesn't really understand him. If he really understood him, he would be on board. Well, folks, nothing's further from the truth. Okay, so, as an academic, as a therapist, I do believe very strongly in the notion of authenticity and realness. And, when I look at Jordan Peterson as a person, there are a couple of things that really strike me. One is that he comes across as a very angry man, very righteous man. And there are times when I go, in days gone by, I wouldn't want to cross him because I could find myself either in the wrong room with the Inquisition or at the end of a hangman's noose because of my thinking being different to his. I might be a bit strong in that, but I do get a strong sense of his personal anger, which I suspect actually arises from a strong, deep-seated narcissistic wound, could unleash some aggression and potentially some violence. So, in that context, I've got to go, well, who was this little person once upon a time as a child? And I suspect Jordan Peterson wasn't a really happy camper as a kid. I could be doing him some disservice, but I suspect that he was sort of a little wimpy kid who couldn't quite feel his social position strongly enough amongst his peers. I very much doubt whether he was a jock when he was in high school. I don't know. I'm just guessing, right? But I certainly also suspect that he didn't have exactly glowing success with women. There's aspects of his behaviour and the way he addresses women where on the one hand he seems to imply that he respects women greatly. Certainly he has a wife and a daughter, so, I would like to think that that's the case. But on the other hand, he can be, almost vicious in his attack of feminism. Perhaps not almost. Perhaps he is just vicious in his attack on feminism. So let's get to the gist of this for today, because I think I might actually need to do a couple of these on Jordan, because ultimately I called him an enigma, an enigma, because he is a complex person. He's not easy to understand. There are things that I listen to where I go, yep, spot on. I totally get where you're coming from. But unfortunately, there are little gold nuggets in a mountain of offal at times. And I mean that absolutely literally. His stuff on certain areas of which he is not an expert in. I mean, he's a clinical psychologist. He's not a biologist. He's not a philosopher in a sense, although he's very widely read, and I appreciate how widely read he is. But there's very clear evidence that he's not a well-trained philosophical thinker. And that is different to being a well-trained psychologist. I studied both, and I can understand and appreciate the differences at times that apply. So let me start off with saying that in my view, there's absolutely no question that Jordan Peterson is very smart. And I suspect that that's probably one of the things that saved his bacon when he was a kid. That he could become the, literally elegantly verbose kid who could wipe the floor with you and you'd walk away going, wow, I know I've just been kicked in the guts verbally, but I'm not sure what to do with it. But one of the questions we need to ask is that, what I suspect is a narcissistic overlay, is it possible that his confidence exceeds his competence? He certainly tackles a vast variety of topics. So, part of the person now intertwines, intricately with how he presents himself. And one of the things that I find irritating is that, the way he puts things is actually quite slippery. You can never quite be sure about what he's actually really saying. There's, pinning him down on definitions is hard because he makes up his own definitions about stuff. So it's also a way of making sure that you can never be criticised of being wrong. And I think that is one area that a lot of people pick up on. And those who do not like him now get carried away and just try to wipe the floor with him completely. I think the man has some value, but he also makes some very outrageous claims. In one early interview, he claimed to be an evolutionary biologist. Now, I'm not sure where he gets that from because he's anything but a biologist. Let's take the evolutionary thing out. We know he has a very strong affinity with evolutionary psychology. And I've already mentioned in a number of podcasts that I'm not a fan of that discipline. So he's capable of making some very, very quick steps regarding definitions. So, for example, the whole thing about God and Christianity and so on. He creates this extraordinarily super complex explanation and quick step. It's like, watching him shuffle in the ring, a bit like Muhammad Ali. Floats like a butterfly but stings like a bee. So, now let me outline for a moment some of the areas where I think we've certainly got a bit of a problem. So I tend to see that the assertions that he makes in biology, philosophy, and theology are problematic, especially in biology. That whole thing with the lobsters and serotonin, and I spoke to a biologist about this, and there's a really good podcast, vlog by a biologist who just completely debunks his whole argument. And so when I started looking at some of the research that he quotes, he cherry picks. He's also boldly ventured into arguing against climate change, making the ancient climate skeptic error of mixing up weather and climate, according to Michael Mann, who's an atmospheric scientist at Penn State University. The problem is people like Joe Rogan have facilitated him. And, in that philosophically he presents a form of nihilism. Okay, so let me get a bit more specific. So let's take a quick snapshot of his ideas of biology and evolution. Jordan Peterson claims that we have an evolutionary ancestor in the lobster, and therefore we are like lobsters in our biological drives, especially towards dominance hierarchies. He's pinched this from evolutionary psychology as well. And, I'd argue that evolutionary psychology struggles to assert its place as a science. It's a bit like economics. They're interesting stories that we tell. It's like Jung. It's an interesting story that we tell ourselves to make sense of something that is not so well known. So I can't help but be exceptionally skeptical when he starts talking either in evolutionary terms or in biological terms. So now let's go on to the whole hierarchies and serotonin. Now, in my view, in human society, hierarchies are social constructs. And most of those have derived from a shift towards agriculture, into patriarchy, into religion, and into economics, in a sense, and especially neoliberal economics. Now, his argument about serotonin is completely bogus. I could argue, and P.Z. Myers argues, that serotonin is found in bananas. So are bananas hierarchical, right? So Myers, and I'll quote him, he says that endocrine evolution is not an evolution of the uses to which they are put, an evolution, not to put it crudely, of chemical formulae, but of reactivities, reaction patterns, and tissue competencies. And it's also important to then recognise that Jordan Peterson's world view is especially a worry. Peterson doesn't speak for what is normal. He has a jargon of authenticity that he's just simply an academic fighting for truth, and that's not true. Underneath it all, Jordan Peterson is an authoritarian, and given half the chance, he would express his ideas in totalitarian terms. So in that worldview, he's stuck in a black and white framework wherein he uses oversimplifications, sweeping generalizations throughout his work. So what about his appeal to nature? Okay, so, that's also problematic. It's a bit like patriarchs arguing that, there's a gender difference and men are like this and women are like that because that's how nature made us, right? So, men are superior, women are inferior. Now, modern day patriarchs won't put it in those terms because they know they would face a poor reproductive future, to put it politely. What can I say around that? Whilst Peterson does admit that hierarchies do have a cost, mainly to those at the bottom, he argues that these hierarchies are natural. Now, men being superior, that's rubbish. In fact, human beings have evolved through being collaborative, to be, altruistic, to work together, and I've talked about this in previous podcasts. So in that context, as I said earlier on, or hinted at, he seems to have a very worrisome relationship towards women and gender relationships. He locates violence towards women as men's sexual frustration. And I can't help but go, that is just bogus. So what's his solution to this? And that's enforced monogamy. Right? Everyone should be married. Forget about personal choice. Forget about, my rights as an individual. That doesn't come into it. And, I can sit back and go, no wonder the ultra-right, the conservatives love him to bits, and all those poor guys who feel, like they haven't got a foot in the door in the social relationship with women, here is a little clickbait that they can hang on to and exploit. And certainly the pickup artists do a lot with that. So he also around that argues that there are no rules about gendered behaviour in the workplace. Well, HR rules are explicit. If someone's behaviour makes you uncomfortable, then let that person know. And if they don't back off, report it and escalate it to HR. Now, the interesting thing that I really found is the last point on this, and that he argues that violence regulates conflict between men and keeps it civilized. Really? And he sees this as a clear rule. And then he goes on to say that men don't know how to control crazy women because they're not allowed to be violent towards them. Now, that is a very disturbing worldview, especially if I think about this man as a clinical psychologist. That is just horrific in my book. In fact, if I personalize this and if I think about myself into a situation where I'm in conflict with other men, my first reaction is not that I can smack him in the head and that's what's going to control the violence or potential violence here. Now, especially in my youth, I had a particularly good advantage on a physical front because I'm 6'3", and as someone once said to me, geez, we wouldn't mind having you on the football team. That's not how I operate. That's not how I roll in the world. My reaction to dealing with conflict is to find a common understanding between one another, not the fact that we know that we could hit each other and therefore we maintain control over our violence. In fact, the world's full of violence where men are completely out of control with that shit. So I don't know where he gets this from, and this is one of the things that deeply, deeply disturbs me. At this point, I'm going to go, okay, there's a lot more in this, and I will make another podcast around this. But let me round off by saying that there are certain things that he says within the realms of psychology and therapy to which I have an affinity, right? One of the things is that Jordan Peterson is a Jungian. Now, as a strictly scientific model, I don't hold a lot in store for Jungian psychology. However, I find it to be an intriguing and rich metaphor to operate within. So, for example, as if I let my shadow go, that could be really interesting because it's the part that I want to keep under wraps because it's not good socially. If I want to call that a shadow, that's great. If I want to call that repressed rage, it is what it is. It's a language that we use. It's a story that we tell ourselves. Is it factual? Probably not, because I can't find a flip side in my personality from a neuroscience point of view. Okay, so it's a really interesting thing. Sam Harris made a really interesting observation. He says to Jordan Peterson, I will grant you that there are means that would amount to a kind of costume party where you can think in terms of myth. It's like, Joseph Campbell in a way. If you said to me, Sam, I want you to think of the rest of your day in terms of the hero archetype, what are you going to do today to slay the dragon and bring back that hoarded wealth to your community? Well, that's a pattern of thought that I have no question that it could have some utility, right? But it's representational. It's not factual in that sense. It's just a way of, telling a nice story. But we need to be careful with the sort of stories that we build in our culture. And as we've recently seen, some of the stories, like patriarchy, like some of the religious beliefs and factions are, perhaps in one way well-meaning, but they are ultimately dangerous. Just like things like, totalitarianism, just like fundamentalism. So we need to think carefully about what we join up with, what we credit to making our life better overall. All right, on that note, I'm signing off, and until next time, part 2, have a good week, look after each other, and seek harmony.
Thank you for listening to Inspired Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. For more information on the Making Good Men Great movement, or for individual and group coaching sessions with Gunter, visit goodmengreat.com. For inquiries regarding broadcast topics or appearing on the show, email Miranda@noirtainment.com. That's Miranda at noirtainment.com. TAINMENG.com.